Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first story takes us to Sullivan Cave in Indiana, where a university student gets stuck in a narrow passage and separated from his group. Somehow, 11 people leave the cave without realizing they've left him behind, alone and trapped for days. The second story follows two divers who illegally enter a flooded cave system in Tennessee. When things go wrong in the murky underwater passages, one of them faces an unimaginable ordeal. As always, viewer discretion is advised. 10 miles south of Bloomington, Indiana lies the state's fourth longest cave, Sullivan Cave. With a total mapped length of almost 10 miles, 16.1 kilometers, this limestone labyrinth is owned and managed by the Karst Conservancy. Groups wanting to explore its depths have to apply for permission and are strongly recommended to be expert or advanced cave explorers because of its notorious difficulty. Sullivan Cave has been drawing explorers since at least the 1800s, evidenced by historical markings found in a section known as Backbreaker, a tunnel so low that you have to crawl through it on your belly. The cave's complexity is staggering. Countless side passages branch off from the main routes, creating a three-dimensional maze that has claimed explorers before. Many of these passages are unmarked, unmapped, and lead to dead ends, or even more dangerous sections. In the 1990s, vandalism became such a problem that a large gate was installed at the entrance. Any group wanting to enter had to unlock the door on their way in, then lock it securely behind them to ensure no unauthorized explorers could wander into the dangerous passages. On September the 17th, 2017, Lucas joined the caving club at Indiana University. He was drawn to the adventure, the camaraderie, and the chance to explore places few people ever see. When the club organized a visit to Sullivan Cave, he eagerly signed up. Despite the cave's difficulty rating, it was Lucas and 11 other club members, including one staff member, drove to the cave's parking lot. Before they headed out, Lucas made a decision he'd later regret. He took off his jacket and left it in the car, thinking the physical activity would keep him warm. He grabbed his small backpack containing 2 Cliff Bars and 2 water bottles, then followed the group toward the cave entrance through the wooded trail. They reached the imposing metal gate at about 10:30 a.m. The staff member produced a large key, and all 12 explorers filed through the entrance into the cool darkness beyond. The temperature drop was immediate and noticeable. They immediately divided into 2 groups of 6 to better manage the expedition and ensure everyone could navigate the challenging passages safely. For almost 3 hours, they explored the vast network of tunnels and chambers. Lucas was amazed by the underground world. Massive rooms opened up unexpectedly after tight crawlways. The group moved through various chambers, including some of the easier sections near the entrance. Lucas felt confident and excited, chatting with other club members about the experience. But on the way back, everything changed when they reached the Backbreaker section. This wasn't just another passage. The Backbreaker lived up to its name. The tunnel ahead was brutally low, barely 18 inches high at its lowest point and stretching for about 50 feet, 15 meters. You had to crawl on your belly, pushing your gear ahead of you, with teeth like stones scraping your back. Lucas watched the experienced spelunkers ahead of him disappear into the narrow opening one by one. When his turn came, panic started to creep in. The opening looked impossibly small. Instead of taking his time like the others, Lucas decided to rush through the section. The thought of spending long minutes trapped in that stone vise was unbearable. He pushed forward quickly, trying to squeeze his way out. In his haste to catch up with the others, disaster struck. About halfway through the passage, at the narrowest point, Lucas's backpack became wedged between his body and the ceiling. The straps caught on a protruding piece of limestone. He tried to push forward, but the pack wouldn't budge. He attempted to back up, but the angle was wrong and his shoulders were now pinned. He was completely stuck. The limestone ceiling pressed down on his backpack, which pressed down on his spine. He couldn't move forward or backward. He couldn't even lift his head more than a few inches. He tried twisting his shoulders, compressing his backpack, arching his back. Nothing worked. For what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Lucas struggled against the confining rock. He called out, but his voice barely carried in the narrow passage. Finally, in desperation, he managed to slip out of his backpack straps entirely. By pushing the pack ahead of him and squirming forward on his belly like a snake, pressing his face into the gritty cave floor, he managed to break free from the narrow section. In his panic and relief, he made another critical error. The exit from Backbreaker led to a junction of several passages. In the darkness, disoriented and still shaking from his ordeal, he missed the narrow opening that led to the main exit route. Instead, he accidentally veered into a different section of the cave, one that led deeper into the unfamiliar areas. The passages here looked deceptively similar to where he'd been before. Same limestone walls, same rocky floors, same oppressive darkness. But something felt wrong. The airflow was different, staler, more stagnant. After several minutes of walking through unfamiliar tunnels, passing junctions he didn't recognize, the horrible realization hit him. He was lost. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks. The silence was absolute. Following the cardinal rule of cave exploration, he decided to wait where he was rather than wander further and risk getting more lost. He called out repeatedly, but his voice was disappearing into the maze of tunnels. No one answered, no one came. For about 30 minutes, he waited in that spot, checking his watch obsessively, thinking, surely they would notice he was missing and come looking for him. But what if they didn't realize? What if they thought he'd already made it out? Growing impatient and increasingly worried, Lucas began to search around his immediate area. His headlamp revealed several passages branching off in different directions. That's when he spotted something that gave him hope. Faint air current markings on the cave wall, arrows scraped into the limestone that seemed to point toward the fresher air. These markings are left by cave explorers to indicate the direction of airflow, which typically leads toward cave entrances. Following these markers became his lifeline. He moved carefully through several twists and turns, each arrow leading him deeper into unfamiliar territory. The passages here were larger, easier to navigate, but completely unknown to him. After what felt like an eternity of following the markers through the labyrinthine passages, Lucas eventually saw the most beautiful sight imaginable, a faint glow of natural light in the distance. His heart leaped with relief as he hurried toward the light, certain his ordeal was finally over. But as he got closer to the entrance, a new kind of dread settled in his stomach. He didn't see anyone else, no voices, no movement, no sign of his group anywhere near the cave mouth. The entrance area was completely deserted. When he finally reached the gate, his worst fears were confirmed. The heavy metal barrier was locked tight, the padlock secured. Beyond it, he could see the empty parking lot. No cars, no people. He grabbed the metal bars of the gate and shook them violently. He shouted until his voice was hoarse, but no response came back. What Lucas didn't know was that his group had already conducted a head count. But because club members weren't all that familiar with one another, they hadn't realized he was missing. They had locked the main gate and driven away, completely unaware that one of their own was trapped inside the cave system. Standing at that locked gate, staring out at freedom just a few feet away, but completely unreachable, Lucas felt true despair wash over him. The reality of his situation was just beginning to sink in. Night was falling, the temperature would drop further, and he had minimal supplies. He was locked inside one of Indiana's most challenging cave systems, with no way to call for help and no one looking for him. By 3 p.m. that first day, Lucas wasn't completely panicked yet. Someone had to realize he was gone. As soon as they did, they would come get him. He took inventory of his supplies, 2 Cliff Bars, 2 empty water bottles, and his phone. The phone showed no reception, but he could hear cars from a road nearby, though they were too distant for anyone to hear his calls for help. As the day wore on and darkness crept in, it finally dawned on him that his group must not have realized he was missing. The thought sent a spike of panic through his body. If they didn't know he was gone, how long would it be until some other group came to the cave? Days? Weeks? Maybe months? As night fell completely, bats started emerging from deeper in the cave, flying past him toward the entrance. Knowing they could potentially carry rabies, Lucas retreated deeper into the cave to find somewhere safer to sleep. He found a spot about 100 feet, 30 meters, from the entrance where he could still see a faint glow of moonlight, but was away from the bat flight path. The cave floor was hard limestone, covered in loose rocks and grit. Without his jacket, the constant cold temperature felt brutal. He regretted his decision of leaving it behind because he knew that jacket would have played a massive difference between life and death. On the second day, Lucas returned to the entrance area and waited desperately, hoping to see someone, anyone. By this point, he was getting very thirsty and very hungry. He had eaten both Cliff Bars the day before, and his water bottles had been empty since the previous afternoon. The thirst was becoming unbearable. His mouth felt like cotton, and his lips were cracking. In desperation, he began licking the cave walls wherever he found moisture. To pass the endless hours and distract himself from his deteriorating situation, Lucas wrote goodbye letters to his family on pieces of paper from his backpack. He used a pen to write messages to his parents, his siblings, telling them how much he loved them and how sorry he was. The act of writing these letters made the reality of his situation hit home. He might actually die in this cave. In the evening of the second day, his phone battery finally died. The last connection to the outside world was gone. The darkness became even more oppressive without the option of using his phone's flashlight as backup. His headlamp was his only source of light, and he began to worry about its battery life too. The second night was even more brutal than the first. The cold seemed to penetrate deeper into his body. He walked around the cave entrance area to try to stay warm, but every movement required energy he couldn't spare. When he woke up on the third day, now over 48 hours into his ordeal, he was desperately thirsty and could feel himself getting weaker by the second. Without having eaten in so long, it was increasingly difficult to maintain his body temperature. His movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. He was getting so hungry that he actually considered eating the crickets he found crawling around the cave floor. He caught one and held it in his palm, staring at it for several minutes before ultimately releasing it. He wasn't quite desperate enough yet, but the thought frightened him. As the third evening approached, Lucas felt his strength failing. He curled up into the fetal position near the cave entrance, conserving what little body heat he had left. His lips were severely cracked, his tongue swollen from dehydration. He was beginning to lose hope that anyone would ever find him. Then, just as despair was overwhelming him completely, he thought he saw light in the distance. At first, not sure if he was hallucinating from dehydration and hunger, he stared harder into the darkness. When the light remained steady and appeared to be moving closer, he forced himself to stand and stumble toward the gate. The light grew brighter, and he could make out the figure of a person walking quickly toward the cave entrance with a key in hand. It was one of the caving club leaders, ironically, the same person who had locked him in 3 days earlier. Lucas tried to call out, but his voice was barely a croak. He grabbed the metal bars of the gate and shook them weakly. The club leader looked up, startled, and saw Lucas's face in the beam of his headlamp. After unlocking the gate with shaking hands, the leader, who was also an EMT, immediately began checking Lucas's condition. Despite spending 60 hours in the cave with no food and minimal water, Lucas was found to be in surprisingly good physical condition, dehydrated and exhausted, but alive and coherent. The rescuers asked if he wanted to go to the hospital, but Lucas insisted he just wanted to go back to his dorm room. In what would later be noted as a sign of his mental stability, he carefully collected all his trash before leaving the cave, the empty Cliff Bar wrappers and water bottles, showing that despite his ordeal, he was still thinking clearly. An investigation into the incident revealed multiple failures. Despite having a pre-entry head count and a buddy system in place, Lucas was missed during the exit count. Because the club members weren't all familiar with each other, no one immediately noticed his absence. It wasn't until the third day, when someone found his jacket in one of the vehicles, that they realized someone was missing and returned to check the cave. It's kind of ironic how not taking the jacket saved his life. Although he regretted leaving it behind, and rightfully so, if things hadn't panned out the way they did, its absence would have been the difference between life and death. But fate had other plans, and the jacket was always meant to save his life, just in a different way than anyone could have imagined. This next story is even more mind-boggling. What drives people to break into forbidden places? Is it the thrill of the forbidden, the promise of something extraordinary, or just plain recklessness? For Gant and his friend on August 15, 1992, it would be the allure of massive catfish that would turn their illegal adventure into a nightmare. Nickajack Cave sits submerged beneath the waters of Nickajack Lake, a reservoir created by the Tennessee Valley Authority. This isn't just any cave. It's a protected habitat for endangered bats and strictly off-limits to unauthorized entry. The entrance is blocked by a chain-link fence, and for good reason. The cave system is dangerous, unpredictable, and serves as a critical roosting site for thousands of bats. But none of that mattered to Gant and his diving partner, who arrived at the lake on that Saturday. They weren't certified cave diving specialists through the cave diving section, or even members of the National Speleological Society. They were just regular divers with a dangerous plan and apparently no respect for the law or their own safety. The rumors had been circulating for years among local fishermen, massive catfish living in the depths of Nickajack Cave, growing to enormous sizes in the dark, protected waters. Stories told of catfish reaching 6 to 8 feet, 1.8 to 2.4 meters, in length and weighing up to 200 pounds, 91 kilograms. Whether these stories were true or just fishermen's tales, the two divers were determined to find out. They approached the flooded entrance where the chain-link fence disappeared into the dark water. The barrier was meant to keep people exactly like them out, but it didn't extend deep enough to prevent determined divers from swimming underneath it. Without proper permits, without authorization, and without informing anyone of their illegal plans, they slipped beneath the fence and entered the submerged cave system. The water inside was murky and cold. The cave passage stretched ahead of them, deeper into the mountain, completely flooded by the reservoir above. This was no place for recreational divers, but they pressed on, searching for the legendary catfish. Cave diving is one of the most dangerous forms of diving. Unlike open water, there's no direct route to the surface if something goes wrong. The overhead environment means you can't simply swim up in an emergency. Proper cave divers use guideline systems, carry multiple lights, and follow strict protocols. These two had none of that training. As they moved deeper into the cave system, about 1,200 feet, 366 meters from the entrance, disaster struck. The limestone floor was covered with decades of accumulated sediment, fine silt and mud that had settled in the still cave waters. When Gant's fins accidentally brushed against the bottom, a massive cloud of sediment billowed up around them. The visibility, already poor in the cave's murky water, dropped to zero instantly. The sediment cloud was so thick that their dive lights barely penetrated a few inches ahead. What had been a challenging but manageable dive suddenly became a complete whiteout. Gant tried to stay calm and remain stationary, waiting for the sediment to settle, but his partner, panicking in the zero visibility, began thrashing around trying to find his way out. The movement only stirred up more sediment, making the situation worse. Through the murky haze, while his partner was panicking and exiting, he turned around to grab a hold of Gant and exit along with him. But from a distance and with almost no visibility, he spotted Gant and saw him in a confused state, going up and down, left and right. And then suddenly, he was going in the wrong direction. He tried to swim after the retreating light, but the sediment cloud was so dense he quickly lost sight of it entirely. He called out through his regulator, but the sound was muffled and distorted underwater. By the time the sediment began to settle enough for limited visibility to return, Gant was gone. He was alone in the flooded cave system, with no guideline to follow and no clear idea which direction led back to the entrance. His friend quickly managed to find his way back to the entrance and emerged from the water, alone and panicked. His partner was missing somewhere in the flooded cave system. He immediately called for help, but the situation was complicated by their illegal entry. Emergency responders now had to risk their own lives to save someone who had knowingly broken the law and entered a protected area. Meanwhile, deep inside the cave, Gant was in serious trouble. Lost in the maze-like passages, his air supply running low, he faced every cave diver's worst nightmare. The sediment had finally settled, but he was completely disoriented. Every passage looked the same in the murky water. Every turn could lead him deeper into the cave system, or back towards safety. There was no way to tell. His air gauge showed his supply was dangerously low. In open water, this would mean an immediate ascent to the surface. But there was no surface here, just solid rock above his head and dark water stretching in every direction. Panic set in as he realized he might die down here, alone in the flooded cave. Then, as his air supply reached critical levels, Gant discovered something that might buy him time. About 1,200 feet, 366 meters into the cave system, he found a section where the cave ceiling rose just enough to create a small airspace. The pocket was barely 8 inches, 20 centimeters high, just enough room to get his head above water. Gant managed to position himself so he could hold on to a stalactite formation and keep his head in that precious 8-inch airspace. The limestone formation became his anchor in the darkness. His body remained submerged in the cold water, but his head stayed above the surface in the tiny bubble of air. He could breathe, but he was still trapped with no way out. But rescue seemed impossible. The cave entrance was underwater, protected by fencing, and the exact location of the air pocket was unknown to rescuers. How could they possibly reach someone trapped 1,200 feet inside a flooded cave system? The Tennessee Valley Authority made a drastic decision. On Sunday morning, they opened the reservoir spillway and began lowering the water level of Nickajack Lake. It was a massive operation, dropping the entire lake level by 3 feet, around 1 meter, to expose the top of the cave passage and create more airspace for the trapped diver. The water level dropped slowly but steadily. Inside the cave, Gant would have noticed the change gradually. The 8-inch air pocket began to grow larger as the water receded. More of the cave ceiling became exposed. The stalactite he was clinging to emerged further from the water. For the first time in hours, he had room to move his head without hitting the ceiling. But Gant's ordeal was far from over. He had been in the cave for 16 hours by this point, much of that time spent clinging to the stalactite in that tiny air pocket. The cold water had sapped his strength. He was exhausted, hypothermic, and nauseated from the stress and physical demands of his situation. 6.5 hours after lowering the water levels in the lake, rescue divers were finally able to reach the trapped man. They found him weak and sick but alive, still holding on to that stalactite formation deep in the cave. The lowered water level had created enough airspace for rescuers to navigate the passages and reach him safely. When Gant finally emerged from Nickajack Cave on Sunday afternoon, he was in rough shape. 16 hours in the cold, dark water had left him weak and nauseated. His body temperature was dangerously low, and he needed immediate medical attention. Against all odds, he had survived. The entire rescue operation was a massive undertaking. The Tennessee Valley Authority had to alter water levels across their entire system to save one man who had illegally entered a protected cave. The cost in resources, manpower, and coordination was enormous, all because 2 divers decided to ignore the law and enter a restricted area. Both were heavily fined by the authorities. They were lucky enough not to be sent behind bars for illegal trespassing. Gant's survival came down to finding that tiny air pocket and having the strength to hold on to a stalactite for 16 hours while rescuers figured out how to reach him. Those 8 inches of airspace, created by the natural limestone formations millions of years in the making, were all that stood between him and certain death in the dark waters of Nickajack Cave.